If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Humans have been making alcoholic beverages for eons, though it was only in the last few centuries that we really began to nail down just what exactly it takes to brew beer. Thanks largely to beer lovers who wanted to know more about this delicious beverage, we now understand the intricacies involved in the brewing process, which allows us to produce a consistent product that more or less resembles what we're aiming for. Interestingly, despite modern advancements in brewing science and knowledge, many remain married to the approaches developed so long ago. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this Brews Views episode to discuss our unfiltered opinions about the adherence to traditional brewing approaches is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. But y'all, it's okay for things to change. And it's okay for our understanding of how things work to change. I really think that's like one of the coolest things about science and learning new things is it changes our opinions about and practices. And I think that's really cool. So, on the one hand, I certainly see why people want to continue brewing the way that they do, given the results that they have. But I also, really don't understand this trend of, I don't know if this is an appropriate term, but like villainizing or trivializing people with different experiences and opinions and a different way of doing things. So I'm pretty excited to talk about this one, and I really hope I don't piss anyone off.
And if you do, that's not on you, Cade. That's on them. I'm a big adherent to that idea that if you're getting angry or butthurt, then you need to kind of maybe look in the mirror and self-reflect a bit. I've really come to enjoy these Brews Views episodes. There's just something kind of cathartic about talking so openly about certain topics, though I have to admit sometimes it's a little anxiety provoking, and this is one of those times because the topic is so, kind of heated. I guess my concern is that people are going to interpret us as sharing our opinions, or the fact that we're sharing our opinions as us saying that those who disagree are in some way like lower than us, and trust me, that is so not the case. I feel like there's something valuable in hearing ideas that may run counter to my own without getting all frazzled about it. Plus, it's just beer. We really do appreciate the fact people have different views, and we certainly don't expect anyone to adopt ours. Now, just a reminder, this is a Brews Views episode, meaning we're not going to censor ourselves as much as we usually do. So if certain language is something that bothers you, this may not be the episode for you. All right, if you enjoy this show and would like to make sure it sticks around, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where in return for making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. For this month, that guest is the awesome Vito DeLucci, who in addition to working behind the scenes at More Beer, recently started his own brewery in Brentwood, California called Imperial Beer Project. Prior to going pro, Vito was an accomplished home brewer who had some pretty rad influences, rubbed shoulders with some really cool people. This session is going to be a ton of fun. In order to be in on the action, you have to make your pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by March 26th. 2021 at the latest, as Vito will be taking questions on Saturday, the 27th. As a patron at this level, you'll have access to all past sessions as well with guests like John Palmer, Russian River's Vinny Chilurzo, Grandmaster BJCP Judge Gordon Strong, and so many more. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear such as the turnkey BH15 Pilot brewing system, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware has a ton of unique purpose-built products, so much stainless, beautiful stainless, useful to both professionals and home brewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy when you're checking out to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Listener Brian Till from Seattle, Washington, had some feedback related to something I said in our recent Short and Shoddy episode where we focused on Munich Dunkel. Brian said, I was interested to learn that Munich malts can give a cherry-like flavor to beer. I recently brewed a Märzen that included 25% Best Malts Munich malt and 6% Skagit Dark Munich, which was my first time trying warm fermentation. He used L17 Harvest, he said, and he says, the yeast fell to the back of my fridge, partially froze before I used it, so I made a 1 liter starter the day before, and there was good activity. Right on. It was not the best beer, with kind of a harsh sulfur note, but also a fairly prominent cherry cough syrup flavor in the finish. The sulfur mellowed with time, but the cherry cough syrup never went away and was unpleasant enough to me that I ended up dumping the last half of the keg. I don't want that flavor in my lagers. Neither do I. I then made a Vienna lager that also included 9.5% Skagit Munich, which I also warm fermented with L13 Global this time. The sulfur and cherry cough syrup were again present, but more subtle. Based on these two experiences, I concluded that the cherry cough syrup was some kind of an ester produced by the warm fermentation and vowed that I would never warm ferment a lager again. But now that you mention that Munich malt can give a cherry flavor, I wonder if that was the cause and maybe I should not give up on warm fermentation yet. Although I will say I subsequently made a Helles Export lager with 4% Weirmann Munich and a Helles Bock with 16% Weirmann Munich, both cold fermented with L17 Harvest, and neither had the cherry cough syrup flavor. Have you ever gotten the cherry flavor from a Munich containing beer that you have brewed with traditional cold lager fermentation methods? Now, to be clear, my perception of a cherry-like flavor when using large amounts of Munich malt is completely subjective. I'm not trying to, that's how I perceive it. It may not be the case for everyone. Now, I can say that it's very, very subtle. This is not cherry cough syrup. If that's what I tasted, if it was a cherry cough syrup thing that I tasted, I'd be thinking possibly a contamination or perhaps even brewing with water that has chlorine or chloramines in it, because at least in my experience, most cough syrup, I believe, is made with a phenol because that's what soothes your throat. So I can't say, as for your question about fermentation temperature, I have never gotten anything from a warm fermented lager that I don't really get in lagers fermented cool. If I'm using a bunch of Munich, I get that same subtle cherry note regardless of fermentation temperature. In fact, it was before I started fermenting lagers warm that I first detected that. So...
Oh yeah, I've been sort of giddily sitting over here smiling because there's an episode of the Brew Lab podcast that's going to come up in a few weeks with Dr. Luis Castro, and the topic of that show is oxygenation and high gravity brewing. But one of the cool things that we're going to do there is talk about flavor compounds that yeast can produce under adverse circumstances, and one of those compounds is benzaldehyde, and benzaldehyde is notorious for this sort of cherry and almond extract flavor. Yeah. Okay. So if you're thinking like cherry cough syrup, this benzaldehyde, that could absolutely be what it is that you identified. So that higher temperature could be producing excess benzaldehyde, which is that cherry sort of almond extract flavor. So that's pretty cool. So listen to that episode with Dr. Luis Castro. But the other thing I'll say is when I was talking about cherry, I'm talking about dark fruits, like pitted fruits, in terms of the Munich Dunkel. I'm not talking about cherry cough syrup, certainly. It's just that sort of dark fruit flavor, those plums and cherries and raisins and that kind of stuff. That's what I get from that Munich malt. I've never, whenever I've used Munich malt, I've never had a like cherry bomb or anything like that. So I do wonder if it was the combination of the higher temperatures, maybe with that, and maybe the malt itself has, a precursor for benzaldehyde or something. So who knows? But anyway, that's sort of plug in the brew lab there, and hopefully that's useful answer to your feedback.
Yeah, the only other thing that I thought of was I think I commented on this recently. In fact, I've used yeast that just wasn't in its prime. And it sound, Brian said that this yeast froze partially, and yeah, it showed signs of life. but that yeast was really stressed. I mean, if you froze it and then melted it back down, perhaps there was something phenolic about that. I commented on a Kolsch that I made years ago, just as a test. It was when I was testing out Brewing a Bag. I grabbed this Kolsch yeast that I had harvested, 6 months prior. I didn't make up a starter. I just tossed it in, and it smelled like burnt rubber. Again, that's a phenol, and that is not a good thing. And if you're using a bunch of Munich malt with that stressed yeast, I could see it kind of coming across maybe as a cherry cough syrup thing. I don't know. The other note to make here is that, in my experience, at least, these craft malts are more rich in flavor than the big guys are putting out there, like Weyermann. So it could have something to do with just the amount of that Skagit Munich that you used. And I'd love to try that stuff. I've heard really good things. But yeah, we really do appreciate the feedback, Brian. Hopefully we were able to respond adequately. All right. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. Based on our numerous experiments looking at the impact of mash temperature, which have pretty consistently shown it doesn't seem to have much of a perceptible impact while certainly affecting attenuation, I hypothesized that one way to pack more flavor into lower ABV styles is to use more malt than you might typically, but mash warmer than you usually would. The resultant wort will certainly have a higher OG, but it won't ferment as low. And since higher FG doesn't appear to be associated with perceptible sweetness, you'll have more flavor while keeping the ABV in check. Well, listener Francisco Jones was curious to test this out for himself and brewed a British mild ale that he mashed at 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 C. The OG was 1046, which is 8 points higher than what the BJCP recommends. And the beer finished at 1017, which is 4 points higher than recommended. That put the ABV at 4%, which is right around the acceptable mark, about 0.2% higher than BJCP recommends. How did the beer turn out?
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
We love this beer.
Why do you drink? To do beer reviews.
Why must you live?
What do you think, Tim?
It's dark. It's not that dark, though. Medium. No smell whatsoever.
Don't drink anything you can't smell. Life lesson.
It's good. It's kind of plain.
That's good.
It's good.
Assuming it's at least over 4.5 ABV, then I like this. We're the worst people to review beers because what we like is less flavor.
I do like this, though.
Yeah, I like it too because there's not a ton of flavor. Yeah, that's really, really good.
It is.
Because it's not in your face. It's not trying to be pretentious. It just is like, how about a little bit of flavor? You like that? You like that? You like that?
What do you think it is? It's a light stout. Huh?
Oh, stop.
Come on, it is.
We don't know what it is. You literally heard the word light stout 5 hours ago, and you think everything's a light stout. It's not a light stout. It's a beer.
That's it.
It is good.
It's good. I like it. It's got a little roasty.
But the pretentious people may not like the fact that we like that it doesn't have a ton of flavor.
Oh, well.
It doesn't have a ton of flavor, which makes it good to me. I like it. Do you like it, Tim?
I do.
Okay, well, Tim likes your beer, person.
Keep up the good work.
Make more.
It's very good.
10 jerseys.
That's it.
10
All right,
jerseys.
we'll go. Man, that's good.
Yep.
I'll do
jerseys.
10 as well.
To 300,000 jerseys.
I feel like the guys did a pretty good job on this review for not knowing what it was and for it being the very last beer in a review session. A bit roasty, flavorful, yet not overly so. Personally, I absolutely loved this beer. I could have drank it the rest of the night. It had all of the qualities I appreciate and enjoy in a nice mild ale, and there were absolutely zero indications that it was mashed so warm and finished with such a high FG.
I feel like I would just have such a good time hanging out with Jersey and Tim. I mean, the Hank Williams Jr. In there, and then the random movie quotes, and just I also too just the complete lack of pretentiousness, right?
Yeah,
like they just don't care. It's just a good beer, and I just love that. I'd have so much fun hanging out with them. But this is also just a really cool idea for a beer, right? Like milds are so good, and I love them whenever they're done well. I really like that they're low ABV because you can just drink a lot of them and you don't feel like crap the next day.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this one was really, really, really nice. The guys seem to really like it and think it was crushable. So fantastic job.
Yeah, and for being mashed at 160F, that's pretty impressive. It validates my hypothesis over here, and I've done it as well, and it works really well at keeping that ABV low. It does increase the caloric content because you're going to get calories regardless of those whether those short chain or long chain dextrins ferment out. You know, they're in there, so this isn't how to brew a low calorie beer necessarily, but low ABV that still tastes good. And I'm glad Francisco sent me that bottle. I was excited. We actually went back and forth over email, and he finally agreed to send me one. So I was stoked about that. So thanks a ton, Francisco. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We got to take a quick break. When we're back, we're going to be sharing our open thoughts on the adherence to traditional brewing approaches. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Those of us who love beer and enjoy the process of making it absolutely owe a huge debt of gratitude to all of the brewers who came before us, as each and every one of them in some way contributed, big or small, to our current understanding of the brewing process. While humans have been making booze for a very, very long time, the organized act of brewing as we know it today is relatively new, just a couple centuries old, and many of the methods developed back then are still used today.
Yeah, and this is one of those things, the historical relevance of brewing methods is really sort of a cool topic that we could also spend an entire podcast talking about. Like, how did brewing methods, even come to be, right? I mean, how did these things develop? I mean, surely, back, thousands of years ago, whenever the first fermented beverage was made, the person who did that had no idea what they had done.
It was magic, right? Like, what the hell did we create here? Yeah.
Yeah, and so I always sort of look back at this as sort of like a fun take. It's just kind of, of course, I mean, obviously things change, technology changes, and we change the way that we brew and how we do those things. But I do think it's really cool to just sort of look back and think about like how little we knew about what goes on, how little we still know, and sort of what the future holds in store for us.
Yeah. I was, I believe it was the History Channel. God, it must have been in the last decade, but not recently. Put out like a history of beer that got a lot of talk in brewing circles when it came out a while ago. But in that one, there was this proposed, idea that, the first beer was made because some Egyptians or somewhere, not in America at the very least, they had a clay pot and which they collected their grains in, and they went out and there was some water. It rained and that water got in this clay pot and it germinated the grains, and none of this was intentional. That my point is that beer as we know it today is very, very intentional, but the start of it was not that wasn't the case at all. We had no understanding of microbiology. We had very little understanding. I mean, our farming tactics, even back then, thousands of years ago, there was a lot of, praying to the rain gods and stuff like that. It had nothing to do, or very little to do, with controlling where things were going to end up, I guess. And it's so interesting to me because we do a lot of things today, and it's not just in brewing. We know that. We do a lot of things today because, like you said earlier, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The biggest limiter in that quip, in my opinion, is that, but what if you can do it better, more efficiently, fill in the blank, positive.
Exactly.
And that is kind of where we're at here. So you think about things, for example, like the 60-minute mash rest, right? This is one of those things that for, I think, so many brewers, when they get into all grain brewing, it's just what you do. And I was so dogmatically married to the idea that you have to mash for 60 minutes because somebody told me that, or I read it in some book. The main reason mash rests ended up taking so long, or why the recommendation was it was so long, at least based on my research, and Cade, I'm sure you know more about this than I do, was because the malt wasn't nearly as modified back when people were brewing, started brewing and writing things down and organizing this thing we call the brewing process. And so in order for the conversion to occur adequately or efficiently enough, you had to let it sit for quite a while, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that's a great example of this, the mash methods, like 60 minutes. Like what about 60 minutes is special? Like, is the number 60, is it, I remember somebody asked this question tongue in cheek a while back, and they just said, it's not like the mash goes ding at 60, like all done.
It's so true.
I mean, like, what exactly about, like, why not 65 minutes, or why not 55 minutes, or why even increments of 5, and so this is sort of where you kind of look back at these things and say, okay, well, 60 minutes is just sort of a rule of thumb, right? It works. It worked. And why did it work? Well, like you said, there, for a long period of time until relatively recently, talking about the last 100 years, of brewing, malt was very undermodified, and you didn't have as much diastatic power. You didn't have as much ability to get to those fermentable sugars that were in the grain. So you'd want it to sit in that sort of warm water for a long period of time. And then, as people, it was just sort of, that's what we've been doing for the last hundreds of years or 1,000 years. So then you start to think about tweaking it and okay, what specific temperature should I keep the mash at? And then, you find a temperature that works for you on your grains in your location. And then you start teaching other people to brew that way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of how these traditions come to play. That's a fantastic example of that one. I love that one. I also love the decoction example as well.
There are so many of these that we could focus on. One of the big ones for me is decoction. And if everywhere you look, when it comes to decoction, at least everywhere that I've looked, they always hit on the fact, again, malt modification and needing to maintain mash temperatures. And that was their way of doing it. So the genesis, the impetus for the decoction mash was primarily as a means of making sure that you were creating the best environment possible for conversion to happen. And when it comes to decoction, that happens to mean maintaining temperature, right? While also extending the length of those rests.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, think about it. They didn't have a thermometer, right? So how do you know when you're at 145 degrees versus 148 degrees, right? I mean, nobody knew that. There's just no way.
Yeah, when you can hold your palm on the kettle for less than 2 seconds, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's funny, but there are some stories about that too, right? Yeah. Like if I can stick my hand in the mash, then it's too cold. But if I can stick my hand in the mash and then have to immediately pull it back out, then it's good enough, right? I mean, there are stories about how people used to brew this way. It's like, why is that not a thing that's still something that we do these days? Well,
absolutely.
It's because we have a thermometer, right? I love that one. The other one that I think about a lot too is this is a more recent trend, like Burtonizing, right? Burtonizing your water.
God, yeah.
Or the rule of thumb, add a teaspoon of gypsum to every beer that you brew. Right. I mean, those things are advice that people still give. And while there's merit to those, I mean, I'm not like trying to minimize that stuff. There certainly can be merit to those things. But Burton-on-Trent had incredibly hard water, right? Incredibly hard water. We're talking like, if I remember correctly, I may be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, it's like 500 or 600 parts per million of bicarbonates.
That's what I recall. Yeah.
Just some insane amount. Like that's way higher than most people are brewing with these days, especially people that are brewing on city water. And I mean so the beer that came out of Burton-on-Trent was due to a large part the water that they were brewing with, so I think you've got sort of all of this different geological and sort of geographical factors that came into brewing traditions, and they made a fantastic beer that came out of Burton-on-Trent, right? Like IPA is an amazing style of beer, and it just happened to be one of the places that made IPA or highly hopped ales a style, right?
I have a hunch though that if we could go back and drink the IPA that was being made in Burton-on-Trent, or drink some of the beers that were being made in Germany 200 years ago, or Belgium, or wherever, and compare them to versions made today, I have a small hunch most of us would appreciate the beer we're drinking today more. That would be in some way better, whether that's less contaminated, because science and understanding and knowledge really does help us do things better. Maybe that's an opinion. I feel like that's a fact, but it really does allow us to hone what it is we need to focus on. One of the more fascinating, again, this is where the brewlosophy part comes into this. I love thinking about this shit, but one of the more fascinating things to me is the how compelled some people feel to justify a traditional method by, and I'm going to use a big word here, inventing other reasons for it to stick around. Does that make sense? Am I being clear there, or?
I mean, yeah, I think so. I think what you're saying is like people are looking for justifications for the way that they do things, right? And for their own personal beliefs and like the way that they do stuff, right? Nobody wants to look like a fool or an idiot in brewing circles. And I certainly think there's an unfortunate trend, I'll say, in homebrewing and in commercial brewing that you have to be right, or you have to contribute like the correct way to brew, and that there's some sort of expectation that exactly why you're doing what you're doing, or for whatever reason, and I think about that a lot, because I do wonder, okay, why are people so married to these recipes? Like, what is it? What causes people to be married? And I include myself in that. There are certain things that I still do, even though I know, or at least suspect, that it's probably not doing anything for my beer.
Well, I feel like though, there are times we adopt a certain approach. And again, it's so hard for me not to think about everything on this, but I'm going to try to keep it focused on brewing. You're taught a certain way. Maybe you have a friend who invites you over to his garage. You want to start brewing. And let's say that they're doing brew in a bag in on a burner and whatever. And you see that and you like their beer. And so you just build your system to match theirs. It's relatively cheap, that you do everything they're doing, and you start making beer that you enjoy. And then you hit the web, and that's when you start seeing things like experiment articles, or you go to places like we talked about this recently on another episode about online forums and such. You go to Homebrew Talk, or you go to Reddit, or you go to Facebook, and you post your thing because you want to share it with others, and you get reamed because you're not doing it the way that it should be done, or the way that people certainly think that it should be done. And there's a part of me that can't help but wonder, what is it that keeps people sticking to that? Of course, there's the investment. You want to justify your investment. So if I've spent all of this money and and all of this time building a 3-tier setup that allows me to do these decoction mashes, even if there's science after science after science that shows that it doesn't really have much, if any, impact on flavor development, you're not getting it hot enough to, caramelize any of that wort. You're just boiling grains, which oddly enough should release tannins, and it doesn't seem to either. But you're going to look for reasons that it's making better beer for you. Whether that's, Pilsner Urquell does it, so it must be good to me. Well, that's an appeal to authority. That is a very well-known bias. Well, they've been doing it since back in 200 years ago. Well, that's the appeal to antiquity, another very well-known bias. And they have to be at play here, right? Trying to justify your decision, the money that you've spent to build out this system. That makes the most sense to me as a reason why people still adhere to these very traditional methods.
Yeah, I mean, I also look at ease, right? I mean, this is the system that I've got set up, or that I've built, or that I have, and so for me, this is what's easy, right? Like, this is the thing that I can continue to do. Like, add a teaspoon of gypsum, right? That's super easy to do, and it probably will make your beer taste a little bit better. I don't know that you should do that in every style or based on what your water profile is. I mean, you can get into the deeper discussions about that stuff, but that's certainly something that especially if you're starting out brewing, right? And you're just looking to sort of tweak and make a good beer, adding a teaspoon of gypsum is probably not a bad idea for the first couple of batches that you do, right? So like, I'm not like poo-pooing on these ideas, but I think it's just more fascinating to think about why people do this. The other thing I always think about is like the pride in my beer, right? Like when I make a good beer that tastes fantastic, I'm super proud of that beer. And I love sharing it with people, and I love other people going, damn, Cade, you made that? That's badass. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could make beer that tastes that good.
Well, I'll tell you, pride. I think that's a good one. I don't think there's anything wrong with being proud of something that you make. But when you allow that pride to consume you and to be what it is that people know about you, I'll tell you this. It's very rare in my experience. And this could be, again, I'm sure it is actually driven by a bit of my own bias and with the things that I remember, right? When I'm out and about and talking to beer people, it's very rare that you're listening to somebody who brews great beer, but using a standard brew in a bag where they squeeze the bag, and the beer's great, but it's very rare that you're hearing them, sit and talk about the wonderfulness of bag squeezing and how to do it right and all that. But I'll tell you, those people who decoct, or those people who, we're going to get into some deeper stuff here in a bit, but those people who are very married to certain traditional methods, they love to talk about it seems, right? And to really, I made this beer doing this, and this. It took me 14 hours. I boiled the wort for 8 hours. I did, and it's like, I wonder how much of you doing that is so that you have this great story to tell people.
Oh yeah. Or you just, you just love talking about whatever it is, you love talking about your process. I also see too, like a lot of those people, go a little bit too far, I guess, right? Like, it's one thing to be proud of what you're doing and talk about your process and share that and be willing to, and think that it's a great process. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, the thinking that you're making a good beer. My problem is whenever it goes a little bit too far, when you suddenly start saying, oh, because I didn't do that, I'm wrong, right? It's this whole concept of like, different doesn't mean worse, right? Different just means different. It doesn't mean anything. It's not a qualitative measurement. It's just different, right? It doesn't matter if it's better, worse, or the same. Right. It's just different, and that's where I think we get into all of this. Talk about adherence, and it's funny too. You mentioned a little bit earlier, like science after science after science showing that something may or may not occur. I think that's also sort of an interesting way to describe it, right? Because I sort of think of science as just sort of generally overarching, a pursuit of knowledge, right? Yeah. But like the evidence, like the individual experiments is what like change, and that's one of the things that I think is just so funny is when confronted with evidence, how people still just double down.
Oh man.
And stay just adhered to whatever philosophy it is that they have.
I'm not sure how appropriate this is on this show, but hell, it's Brews Views. We can say what we want. There's an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed. We might be stupid, but we ain't dumb. I'm not trying to say that I'm like this super smart genius guy, but I'm not stupid enough to not know how to do certain things these days. And so every once in a while, we'll publish a result, post it to Facebook, put it on Reddit, whatever that may be. And somebody will comment, somebody who obviously doesn't like the fact that we either could or couldn't detect a difference in these beers, even though we're not trying to sell them on changing their approach, will comment in a way that makes it seem as though they are a science expert or an expert in experimentation. Now, again, I'm not trying to pat my own back. I have a PhD. I had to write a dissertation. I've done a lot of science, particularly in the field of perception. I've engaged in these experimental pursuits for years. It's not something that's terribly foreign to me. So I have a decent, at least, understanding of it. What cracks me up is when those people are so threatened by what is just ultimately one single data point that they try to make it sound as though they know more than the person who wrote the article, or than Brewlosophy, or than people at, universities who actually make a living doing beer science. And you go and you kind of search, like, I'm going to check out this dude. And, they're a contractor at a construction company or something. And I love that. But if you're so threatened by that you are going to create this image of you being smarter than I just feel like it's so foolish sometimes.
I love that. I love that example because somebody did that on the episode with Shellhammer, right? About the diminishing returns from dry hops.
Oh,
right.
Like the Brew Lab episode. Yeah.
The Brew Lab episode. And it was funny. I think they said something like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but like, stop trying to curb a trend, or oh, this was using unhopped wort, so it's not applicable to anything, right? Like you didn't hop the wort during the boil, so all of your results are somehow flawed. And I just think about that, and I think a couple of things. But first of all, is like, wait a minute, this is a scientist, right? Like he's in a university doing controls. First of all, he never said that there is. If you listen in the episode, he never says that there's a dry hop saturation point.
No, yeah, that's our term. I mean, we
right. Yeah, exactly. That's just the way that we're interpreting his results. It's our interpretation of his results that I think is what's or maybe not like mine and yours individually. I'm using sort of ours as an existential thing. Yeah. Not just me and you, Marshall, but like everybody that reads his results. So we have our interpretations. But the other thing too is it's like, the people can say, well, I brewed a beer with Mosaic, which is a totally different hop that was used in the study, and I dry hopped it at 24 grams per liter, and I definitely noticed a difference from the Mosaic that was dry hopped at 8 grams per liter. Yeah. And it's like, to me, it's that's great. That's an anecdote, right? That's another piece of evidence. And you get to say, hey, this is my experience, and my experience is different than Shellhammer's results, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And for me, the problem is it's when you say, oh, well, because I've brewed a beer with Mosaic at 24 grams per liter, Shellhammer is wrong.
That's right. And that's the key is that, and this is, I put a note not to leave this out as we're discussing this. And I think now is a good time to bring it up, that I feel like an element of this is rooted in people's personality. There are absolutely different personalities out there. We've all, particularly in brewing, it seems to, bring some interesting personalities out sometimes. There is this thing that and I don't want to go to the point of diagnosing people out there, but it starts with an N. And there is this approach to dealing with things that you disagree with in a way that makes it sound as though you are the only right one. And it's so cocky sometimes. It is probably the only personality in the brewing world that I try to stay away from. Not because I disagree with the way you're doing things or even it's the way you present yourself. And I'll be honest, that cockiness, that arrogance, that you're doing it this, I honestly don't care if somebody wants to mash with Dr. Pepper, doing that doesn't bother me. If somebody comes out and says, you have to do it that way, I'm going to think of them the same way somebody says, hey, you don't have to do it that way. You can do it whatever you want. It's your brewing. It's your beer. And this argument that, well, just because I'm a little different than you on the anecdote thing, that is not evidence. That I will never refer to anecdote as evidence. What that is experience. So you think that you noticed a difference. That is all good. If you think you noticed it, you go ahead and keep doing that. It's when you try to convince other people that your way is the right way, where oddly enough, you're doing the very thing that you beat us up for not doing. We're not telling people to change the way they're doing it, but you're going to give us shit if we just put evidence out there, sensory analysis evidence out there, making a suggestion. That's all it is. Oh, look, this seemed in this particular beer to do this thing. Your anecdote does not trump that, is all I'm saying. Now, in your own brewing, maybe it does. That's fine. But your anecdote will never trump Dr. Shellhammer's research. It doesn't mean that he I agree with you, Cade. Shellhammer never said that there's a point to where it saturates and you're not going to get any more. He said there's a point of diminishing returns. Maybe you will get more hop character, but it starts to go downhill and you start to spend way too much money to eke out another percentage of hop character.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite things about the science research that's done. Right, there's always limitations to every single experiment that's performed.
Yeah,
and I feel like that's where things get lost, sort of in translation. Right, is these experiments will say like, or we might, for example, say, refer to it as a dry hop saturation point because above 8 grams per liter in our experiment, in the one that I did at Brewlosophy, tasters couldn't taste a difference between one that was at 10 grams per liter and 15 grams per liter using a variety of hops. Okay. So my result of my experiment was that there was no difference between the two of those. I can report those results. That doesn't mean that Shellhammer did.
Yeah.
And so I think this is where you sort of get lost in translations too, is what I mentioned earlier, is the interpretation of the research, right? And I think that's where we sort of talk about, like you said, personality factors and all this other stuff sort of comes in. And well, I'm doing it this way. This is the way that I've traditionally doed it. This is done it. This is the doed it. I can't believe I just said that. But this is the way that I've traditionally done it. And so I have to justify this, and I have to either pick the parts of his research that I like or pick the parts that I don't like, and use those then to justify. So I think that's also sort of an interesting, way that people approach this, adherence to these brewing practices.
Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, and this is something that I remember when, as I was getting going, one of the kind of the things that I would tell myself is, well, at the very least, if you do something and you ruin a batch, you're going to learn something. There are people, that's a part of my personality. I've been like that as far as, my family members who were around when I was a kid told me that I was always like that. So that is a part of my personality, me going out, wanting to try new things. I don't have a desire to disrupt anything now I don't care if we do, but it's not, I couldn't care less about that. That's not my ploy. It seems like some people think that's the case, but there are those also who would much rather avoid the risk of trying new things. I have a very strong appreciation for that. I married somebody who tends to be more that way. And so I get it, and so risk aversion to me is another reason a lot of these more traditional brewing practices, whether it's mash length or decoction or fermentation temperature even, why they've stuck around, because hey, it's been working for so long, no need to fix it. And I know it's going to work. I know it's going to produce a good beer. I might have a 5 or 6 hour brew day, but it's worth it for me. And a lot of people also enjoy engaging in that slower, there's kind of a romanticism involved in brewing using these older practices. Again, what a beautiful reason to do something, because you want to kind of connect with those roots, that there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is also one of the other ones too, is commercial brewers, right? What commercial brewers are doing. And I think a lot of commercial brewers are practicing risk aversion with some of their practices, right? Sure. Because there's so much on the line to lose. If you've got a 30 barrel batch of beer, that may be $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000 that you've got tied up in one batch. So yeah, I might spend an extra $100 to put an extra, whatever into it that, I might put sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite into the beer because I'm worried about oxidation, right? Yeah. And that may cost me, an extra $50 or $100 to do that, but I'm going to do it because if I don't, I may potentially lose, $20,000. So I think there's the risk aversion for commercial brewers is definitely there, and that definitely makes sense. And you see a lot of home brewers, emulating what commercial brewers do. And I mean, I've got an electric brewing setup now, but my prior setup, the gas setup, and the 3-vessel system and stuff, that's set up to look like a brewery, right? A 3-vessel system. And why did I do that? I don't know, because it was how other people were brewing and they were making good beer and I started making good beer with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you've got all this, the way that people are participate or anticipate what commercial brewers are doing, I think is also really sort of interesting too. commercial brewers, meaning like at the homebrewing scale, or how they're emulating that at the homebrewing scale, and whether or not that's even useful or worthwhile. Things that may make sense at a commercial scale may not make sense at a homebrew scale, and vice versa.
Well, I think a lot of homebrewers would be shocked to spend a day in a 15 plus barrel brewery to see just how different things are. We use all the same terminology. I was just chatting with my friends from Crow and Wolf about this, that there are things that have to be different given the infrastructure differences, really. I mean, I'm not going to go over all of them, but it's not, you think of the pressures put on wort or beer during fermentation in huge tanks. You think about all of the transfers that are going on. It is optimized. Those systems are optimized to produce as much beer as possible in a good way. They're not sitting around and thinking about the things a 5-gallon batch homebrewer thinking about. I remember, I got into brewing in January of 2003, and I remember picking up my extract kit and taking it home, brewing that batch, thinking I was a freaking incredible human being because it actually turned out okay. And going back and talking to the guy at the homebrew shop, and he's like, dude, if you like that, you have got to go all grain. You've got to switch to all grain. And I'm like, how do you do that? And he's like, oh, it's easy. All you need to do is buy 3 of these things, and you do this, and then you run water over the top, and in this fly sparks. And I just remember being like, there's no way in hell I can do that in my apartment at the time, And so I avoided it for quite a long time because it just seemed so complicated. And it wasn't until, and I kind of kept my thumb on the pulse of the home brewing thing. It wasn't until batch barge started to kind of become accepted that I jumped into all grain using that method. And I will tell you, there was such a backlash when batch sparge came around, people claiming that you're not going to get the character that you do if you fly a sparge. And, and I remember when I did it, I was like, well, if it makes decent beer, at least I'll be okay. It made beer that was winning competitions and doing well with my friends. And there was no negative downside, but that adherence to wanting to do it the way that you learned, to doing it the way that you built your system, because that's what pros look like, or that's what you read in some 200-year-old text. It makes sense to me, but that pull to not want to do it. Remember brewing a bag? I don't know. I think you started brewing after that became a thing, Cade. But man, I'll tell you, when those Aussies started talking about lautering in a fabric bag, boy, that was going to be real rough on the brewing scene.
Oh yeah, no, I remember that. I was still fly sparging, right? And I continued to fly sparge after brewing the bag, made things easier for home brewers, or at least for some people. And I mean, we've talked about all these examples, sort of why people are relying or holding tight to their dogma. But again, I think it really just comes back to the problem is whenever somebody thinks that the way that they're doing it is more right, than the other person. And I think that's really, I think that's really what we're getting at here. And I always sort of think about okay, well, is there a different way that we could communicate or that we could talk about? Or is there a more reasonable approach to sharing information? And one of the things I wanted to mention on this was I listen to Hidden Brain occasionally, which is a podcast with Shankar Vedantam on NPR, where they talk about psychology and the way our brain functions. And they did this really interesting experiment where they put 2 people in a room for 30 minutes or an hour or something like that. And they said, okay, tell the other person about yourself and your beliefs. And then at the end of the session, they asked, how well do you know the other person? And everybody said, oh, I know the other person very well. We talked all about blah, 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 this, and this. And they said, well, how well does the other person know you? And they said, oh, not very well at all.
I didn't share very much, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because I've been alive for however long. I've been alive for 33 years. You can't possibly sum me up in 30 minutes or an hour.
Right.
So interestingly, they kind of sent people back into the room and said, okay, now I want you to spend some time learning about their beliefs. And when you come out, you're going to try to convince me that their beliefs are right. Okay. And you're going to tell me about their beliefs. And this sort of flipped it on its head. And when they came out, they said, how much better do you know them now? And they said, oh, I know them much better. Right. And I feel like we really connected, even if I disagree with them or don't have the same beliefs as them. I really, connected with the person. I know them much better now. And it was both sides, right? They know me better and I know them better. So I think this approach was just really fascinating. And I think that's really one way that we can improve, right? Is trying to understand why the other person is has the opinions that they do, rather than just saying, oh, I brew this way, you're wrong.
Well, yeah, and on that note, my thinking is also just to kind of a more simple approach. If you don't want to get into the understanding piece of it and actually be cool with others, at the very least, if you're going to hang your personal securities up on the way you make beer, then by all means do it. You're probably not going to make very many friends, though. Just be cool. I mean, who cares what other people do? I don't understand why there is such concern on certain people's parts in brewing with the way other people want to do stuff. That's not going to affect them in the slightest. Like, you are not going to be the savior of lager beer or of whatever else. Just hang out, share your opinions and your thoughts in the way that you do, and let others be cool. That's my opinion. Now, we just shared a bunch of our thoughts and opinions on traditional brewing approaches and why we think some are apt to continuing to adhere to them despite modern developments and knowledge. When we come back from this break, we are going to focus on a couple more specific areas where this mentality seems to be a bit more prevalent. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. The methods we use to make beer today, from mashing to fermenting, are rooted in centuries of history, and they're used by all brewers in some capacity to make beer. However, there are a few styles of beer, brewing enclaves, if you will, that seem to attract a crowd that takes the adherence to traditional methods a bit more serious than most, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. We talked about it a little bit at the top. We talked about lagering and lager methods, right? Like traditional lager brewing methods. But another one that's sort of, I don't know, maybe it's just to me, I didn't really know about it before, and I'm just becoming more aware of it now. But it's this sour beer brewing. Right? Like traditional versus quick sour methods. Like I'm constantly surprised at how much gatekeeping there is in brewing sour beers.
Yeah, that term gatekeeping, a lot of people will gatekeep, I've realized.
Well, true. I probably do too.
Yeah. Well, they like, oh, it means just this one specific thing, but really all it is that you're disallowing, in essence, other people with different opinions unless they share exactly what your opinions and thoughts. But yeah, man, sour beer brewing, I'd never realized. I think when I think of the modern state today of what sour brewing is, I find it absolutely exciting and neat that you've got these brewers that are capable of have tamed bacteria and yeast and other microbes to produce these beers. I mean, you look at places like the Brewery and Russian River and all of these. I mean, Blue Owl, making these great sour beers using various methods on the spectrum of traditionality, kind of anywhere on there. What is wrong with that? I mean, and that is the question that I find myself asking whenever I go to these certain, I guess, forums, places online, if you will, and you see these interesting personalities just coming out of the woodwork. A perfect example, when we shared the recent episode of the Brewlosophy or the Brew Lab podcast that you did, where you interviewed Dr. Matt Farber about the Philly Sour GY7B yeast. My word, the response to that was mind-blowing to me, that people were so against a yeast that sours. Now, maybe there were other aspects of it they were against as well, but some of the stuff that we ended up having posted on our Facebook that got deleted, interestingly, that was not by us. It really shocked me that there are people out there who were so afraid, or I don't know if that's the right word, but so against this new yeast that seems to sour beer well.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of things that people raised in response to that podcast that I think are sort of interesting and sort of deserve some more explanation on maybe or more exploration. Like the trademarking or patenting the yeast itself. But what really sort of surprised me was the people, and it wasn't just one. I mean, there were a bunch of people that were sort of just saying, oh no, you can't make sour beers with GY7B. Like, you can't make it with a yeast that produces lactic acid. Or if you do make it, you can't call it a sour beer because it's not brewed according to these traditional sour beer practices. Right. And I just remember like thinking that, and I was like, I don't know that I've ever heard anybody like say that before. That might have been my first experience with it. But I was real surprised. And I think back, to my time at Blue Owl, and Blue Owl is an amazing brewery, by the way. I mean, it's a fantastic place, and they're making some really, really good beer. I mean, if you haven't tried Cool in the Gang or Spirit Animal, Cool in the Gang's a sour ale that they do with Earl Grey tea. That beer is refreshing as hell. It's really damn refreshing. And I mean, it's really, really good. And those are brewed using, sour mash. So wort souring principles, right? They're not aging those in in barrels for 6 months, or spontaneously pitching, or using, I mean, there is a mixed culture, that's on the grain sort of naturally. But they're not like these are sour mash that are producing fantastic beer styles. And that's sort of the whole point of Blue Owl, is to, try to explore the depths of sourness in beer, right? I always sort of describe it as, lemon on fish. Like, salt and pepper and seared fish or seared salmon taste great. If you sprinkle a little lemon on there, in my opinion, it tastes better. Right. And it's not like I violated the fish, by sprinkling lemon on it. It's just trying something new and different and exploring the way that sourness as a taste can be added to beer. And I think that's a fascinating new way to think about sours, rather than having to do this like 6 month traditional barrel aging and bottling and, 750 milliliter bottles and, crown caps and all the other things that people think have to, or that some people believe have to happen to have a sour beer.
The aversion to new things in general is something that I've actually researched that a little bit in my as a psychologist, but that aversion. So I get it. I get viewing new ideas, and I don't want to get too deep into other topics, but you look at things like political preferences or religious affiliations and stuff like that. Other ideas can be very threatening. I get that. This is beer. The fact that I really, really want to, but it's so difficult for me to understand the people who feel that it's valuable, that is in some way a good thing to come out and shit on other people for doing what works for them. And that's kind of a theme in this episode, I'm realizing. But if you right now, Cade, were to go make a delicious beer where you made your wort, you boiled your wort for 5 minutes, you chilled that wort back down, and you tossed in some Good Belly in the kettle and kettle soured it over 2 days, and then you boiled it again to knock out that lactobacillus, You kill all that off and you ferment it and you make this beer that you think is delicious and you post that on Milk the Funk. I guarantee you that it's going to create, there'll be 5 or 6 people on there who just start throwing shit at you. There will be a ton of others who support you and who do that as well. But what I don't understand is what motivates this speaks to who I am as a person. What motivates those folks to come out and try to make you feel like crap for doing something that you enjoyed and wanted to share with others? Like, that is such an odd personality quirk to me.
Oh man, that one I wish I was about to say I wish I could understand those people, and I do wish I could understand the people that do that. I never want to be that kind of a person. So if anybody ever finds an instance of me doing that, call me out on it immediately
and punch you in the jaw. Yeah, I got you there, buddy.
Because I really don't ever want to do that. But I just think it's funny, and there was something that sort of popped into my head just now. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I'm reminded of this Stephen King quote from The Dark Tower. It's one of my favorite quotes. So the world will end, and the world will end, it seems, a victim of love rather than hate, for love has ever been the more destructive weapon. And I've memorized that quote. I love it. And I just think about this. Is it because people love their beer like so much? They love the way that they do it so much that they're willing to, go out and ridicule other people or make fun of them or tell them that they're wrong or demean them or trivialize them.
Bro, I'm gonna go deeper. I don't think it's that they love their beer as much as they love themselves, or at the very least are trying to create the impression that they do. Because I've said this before and I stand by this. In fact, I've seen this has been one of the most validated, I guess, kind of philosophies that I hold, is that the more deeply hurt and insecure somebody is, the more likely they are to want to make others feel that. Misery loves company. They want to make others feel just as miserable as they are. And so they go out and the best place to do that, unfortunately, for all the good is the internet. For all the good that it's provided us, there's that side of it. You can go listen to our last Brews Views episode on that topic. It was a good one as well. But I don't think it's just that their beer is great. In fact, I've had plenty of beers from people who are like that. And the beer's nothing special, but they'll talk a good game, and they love to talk about themselves and all the great things that they're doing. This is certainly not the whole entire sour beer culture. This is just one of those areas that I've found. I mean, I remember posting back in Milk the Funk's infancy, I posted a Berliner Weiss, kind of this weird one-off, almost short and shoddy like Berliner Weiss. I was making it and I posted my process that I just started it and posted it to Milk the Funk. And I've never felt compelled to delete something. I deleted that post because of the shit people were throwing at me because I was kettle souring it. I mean, is that really what you want? I mean, for one, but then also I can't help but think that their adherence to those traditional methods is truly because it makes them feel a part of something bigger, which I appreciate, but it crosses the line when you start demeaning and belittling other people for doing it differently, I guess.
Yeah, and I agree, and I want to be clear too. Like, I love Milk the Funk. I mean, it's a fantastic resource.
Yeah. They know
for sour brewing. We're not, want to be very clear. We're not trying to shit on them or anything that they're doing. They're doing a fantastic job.
The reason it comes up is because it is the biggest sour beer brewing forum on the internet that I'm aware of.
That's where you see a lot of those comments, right? Whenever you post an article like you did, and then people just come out of the woodwork and crap all over it. It doesn't feel great. First of all, having somebody crap on your work, but it's also like you said, this is an area like sour beer brewing. This is an area where there seems to be a higher incidence of people that feel like they have to correct you or like point out that you're wrong or something like that, which I'm all for that, right? Like, if I'm wrong, that's why we have feedback on every episode, and I'm serious about that. If you have feedback, please send it to me, because I always want to learn and I always want to grow, and I don't want to be pretentious or a dick, right? But again, at the same time, I don't ever feel the need to go out of my way to make somebody feel bad because of something that they did. I mean, maybe it also is just not an understanding that you're making someone feel bad. I mean, I always sort of think about this whenever I'm writing an email, is how's the other person going to receive this email when I draft it? And that's something that I always think about. Maybe other people just aren't. Maybe it's too easy to just post things on the internet. But yeah, I mean, sour beer especially has been one. And I think about like Sour Visier and GY7B, which are these, I mean, I'm not, Okay, I'm going to use the word novel for GY7B, although I'm going to reserve and put an asterisk there that I'm free to change my mind in the future because of what some people were posting recently. But Sourvisiae, that's a new yeast, right? That was a lab-created yeast that produces lactic acid, and that's a cool yeast, right? Like that's a cool thing. I understand if you have problems with GMOs or lab-created stuff, then that's totally fine, and you're totally entitled to those opinions.
Yeah.
And people need to be, commercial brewers that use that need to understand that there are going to be consumers that are going to have those provisions or positions. But Sourvisiae, that's really cool, and that's kind of badass that we were able to do that as a species, right? Like humans were able to make this yeast do what we want it to do in producing a sour. That's fucking cool.
Yeah, and I'm with you. And the thing is, you're not trying to convince everybody else to think it's as cool as you think it is. It's the opposite direction, though, with some people, right? Well, no, you're obviously not a sour beer expert because you think Sourvisiae or GY7B is cool. No, that's not the case either. It's just ridiculous. Now, I have had this thought that if we were really going by tradition when it comes to sour beer brewing, every sour beer would be inoculated naturally in a cool ship. It would sit in a, somebody's shed that has spider webs that you never remove because of the mysticism that comes along with that. That's not how even these more quote unquote traditional sour beer brewers are making their beer. What they've done is they've cherry picked, all of these, what they want to clump together as the right way to do it. And it's a lot of it is based in tradition and all of that. But dude, if somebody, House of Pendragon, Sean Wood, who's running the sour program at House of Pendragon, their sour beers are so money, and I love sour beer. Like I said, Russian River is one of my favorite sour beer breweries. You've got the brewery. I've had every Cantillon that I can think of. Thankfully, I've got friends who've been to Belgium. I love all that stuff. And yet I'm sitting here as someone with that much experience saying these quick, 1 month turnaround sour beers are absolutely delicious. And to crap on somebody because you think a different approach is better, it just seems so childish to me. And I do wonder sometimes, it just really, if one of these people would actually have the ability to tell apart a quick sour from, I know that there's different microbes and such, but
sure. I mean, I think if you've got a mixed culture in there, like if you've got Brett mixed in with lactobacillus, you're going to be able to tell a difference. But I certainly think people would tell a difference between like Blue Owl's spirit animal versus like a barrel aged pale ale, right? That's going to taste very different. But again, why is one better than the other? Or why aren't both just equally appropriate beers that can be consumed in their own time and place?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I don't understand. Now you brought up the thing about coal ships too. And I just think about that's absolutely how, if you were really trying to brew a sour beer, you'd spontaneously ferment. And my wife asked me something really funny about that the other day. She was like, do bugs and shit get in like spontaneously ferment a beer? And I was like, yeah, yeah, they do.
If you're doing
She's
it
like, that's
right,
disgusting.
apparently.
Yeah. She says, that's disgusting. I was like, I mean, sure, but there's alcohol and everything in there, so nothing dangerous is gonna come out of it.
Yeah.
But spontaneously fermented beers and barrel aged beers are really fantastic.
I love them.
I love them. But I also like kettle sours too. And I think, honestly, I'm probably going to drink more kettle sours than I will traditional sour beers just because I love the way that acidity combines in beer.
So do I.
But yeah, that's sort of interesting. You just think about how people, especially sour beer traditions and why people are so married to those.
Yeah. Well, another area, and perhaps the biggest in my opinion, at least in my experience over the years that I've been a part of this beer scene, obviously is lager brewing. There are, every shade of personality when it comes to lager beer brewing, and folks who are friends of ours who adhere to very traditional methods. Annie Johnson, great friend of Brewlosophy, makes some of the best beer, particularly lager styles that I've had. Absolutely believes that you have to triple decoct a Czech Pilsner, despite what the science says out there. It's for her, it's based on experience, and that is an important thing, and that's fine. She never once, not jokingly at least, has told me, well, but you can't make a good beer if you don't do that. No. She that because she's cool, right? She does it her way. She owns that it's her reason. She got her own reasons for doing it, and that it's her opinion. But she's not going to bash on people for not doing it the same way. That is not the case in a lot of lager brewing circles, which is just blows my mind. There's this genuine adherence to ideas, and I'm not speaking about any specific groups. You've got, like I said, multiple camps. I think decoction is a great example because there are people out there who will spout off that, by taking some thick mash and boiling that, you're going to create a Maillard reaction. You're going to get some caramelization. You're going to put those boiled grains back into your main batch, and it's going to make it taste different, and blah blah blah. There's a lot of science, or, sensory analysis experiments, including an experiment that we've done that suggest it has very little, if any, perceptible impact on the beer. You might get a bit more conversion. We've seen that.
Oh yeah, it's that, and DMS is the other big one for me. The extended boils with DMS. Now I've had DMS taste sensory training, right? Several times. I know what DMS tastes like for me. People always talk about how DMS tastes like this green apple flavor. It doesn't taste like that.
That's
to me. It tastes
acetaldehyde.
like raw.
DMS is cream.
Oh,
corn.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
corn. Yeah. The corn. I don't know why I was thinking acetaldehyde. DMS tastes like canned tomatoes.
Yeah.
To me.
Me too.
Right.
Me too.
It's never tasted corny. I don't understand that flavor, but that's okay, right? Like, that's not to say that it doesn't taste corny to other people. It just doesn't taste that way for me. I've tasted that tomato flavor in beers.
Yep.
But I don't know that, extended boils with today's malts and stuff actually have a flavor, a difference on that. And I'll say this, like, people have shown, and scientists have shown for the last 50 years, there's study after study after study that shows that DMS increases in concentration with shorter boil times, right? Like, if you only boil for 15 minutes, the DMS precursor is there. There's a higher concentration of it. The question I always sort of find is, okay, but how much? And does it matter at the end of the day, right? Like, when we get the beer into the glass, there's a lot of things that happen from the time that the boil ends to the time that the consumer drinks the beer. Yeah. And a lot of those things may have a bigger impact than DMS, right? And so this is where I always sort of, how can you say that you have to do a 90-minute boil and that any beer that is done otherwise is bad?
Yeah.
I just can't. I can always say you can justify the reason why you're doing something. You can usually always find a justification.
Yeah.
But you don't get to turn around and say that because I justified my way, your way is wrong.
Yeah, dude, I'm telling you, the 90-minute boil thing, if you're using a majority of Pilsner malt, that still sticks around. I mean, people still abide by that brewing law, if you will. It's very interesting to me, and I try to like wonder, where did that come from? Yeah, we already talked about time being kind of this amoebic thing, and why 90 minutes, not 95 minutes, not 100 minutes, not 75 minutes. It just kind of stuck, hour and a half, I guess. And I wonder if perhaps there was no understanding of dimethyl sulfide, 200 years ago. Maybe people realize, well, if I boil this, the wort made from undermodified malt for a little bit longer, if we get it hot enough, it seems to take away this undesirable ketchup-y, creamed corn, if that's how you taste it, DMS thing. They didn't know it was DMS. They didn't know the chemistry that was going on to remove it. I wonder if there's a part of, and this is just me kind of shooting from the hip, but I wonder if there wasn't a part of the extended boil thing that was because, malt was undermodified. There was poor conversion back then, which is why decoctions happened. But you can also increase your OG by boiling longer, And so I can't help but wonder if maybe that was an element of it. And then us, as we started to advance in our knowledge of the brewing process, we were able to stick a better reason to the extended boil length thing. Oh, it's Pilsner malt with DMS. Yeah, of course, that's why we do it longer. But it seems to me more practical that you're making different styles with different strengths. Maybe you just want to boil it a little bit longer so you get higher OG.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, right? Maybe I want to boil longer for browning reactions to happen, right? Or for the wort to get darker. Because it's actually sort of caramelizing on the bottom of the kettle, right? Like, those things also might be issues with a 90-minute boil that don't have anything to do with DMS, right? And you may choose to brew a beer differently just because of something totally for a totally different reason.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of interesting too. The reason I had brought up acetaldehyde earlier was that's also something too, is cold fermentations, right? Like, people were changing their fermentation temperature changing their fermentation temperature to get beers done faster, and then like pulling them too early, right? Like, that was always what people were talking about is, oh, you're going to have an acetaldehyde bomb if you pull your beer too early.
Yeah.
And I've had experience with that, right? Like, I certainly, especially at Blue Owl, when you're tasting those beers every day, the first couple of days of fermentation, they're acetaldehyde bombs, right? I mean, they're super, raw pumpkin to me, not green apple, but they're super raw pumpkin, and that goes away over time, right? And that's a personal experience that I've seen, and that's backed up by science. And so for those reasons, we let beer ferment until it's clearly reached its final gravity. before we package, right? To get rid of those taste flavors. But there was never like an adherence to we have to pick the beer out on this day. And I sort of wonder why do certain things stick around? So like why are extended boils, that 90 minutes, why is that the thing that has to happen? And we have to have this long, open, vigorous boil versus like, why aren't we fermenting for like 3 days? Right? Like, or 5 days, or 8 days, or 10 days. Like, why wasn't that the thing that like stuck around as the dogma?
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, you're talking about fermentation. I feel like it behooves us to bring up a cool fermentation or warm fermentation of lagers, particularly as we're focusing on lagers here. Now, we have done an entire episode where we talk about this, so you can go back and listen to that if you want to kind of go deeper into the mud with us on that. But I heard this interesting. I don't know if it was a theory. I don't know if this person who told it to me actually read it somewhere. But this idea that, you think about lager fermentation temperature today, and that is one of the most dogmatic things that I feel like people adhere to is you have to ferment at 10 degrees C or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take a couple degrees. And otherwise, you're going to create an ester bomb or a phenol bomb. It's going to be terrible. It's not going to taste like a lager. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, I admit it. I was talking to somebody and they proposed this idea that lager yeast, it wasn't that these Germans who were making lagers were like, oh, we're going to try fermenting with this different yeast strain. They didn't have any idea about that, right? When it first came, we're just going to keep it cold because we think that that's going to suppress ester and phenol development. That is not the thought process that went into it. There's some evidence to suggest apparently that lager yeast simply favored the naturally cool temperatures of the regions in which those beers were being brewed and the way that they were being brewed. And in a way, it was almost naturally selected. The Pastorianis, the Saccharomyces pastorianis lager yeast, which we refer to today as kind of traditional lager yeast, not necessarily that brewers discovered that lager yeast and intentionally chose it for their beers. That makes sense to me. We like to think that everything is intended, right? That's not the case with beer. We know that. The response that we've gotten to our multiple experiments looking at fermentation temperature when it comes to lagers is just fascinating to me, because it's another one that just brings out the negative, I guess, reactions. People get really frustrated that we're saying, hey, we're showing really that, hey, I fermented with one of the most popular lager yeasts in the world, the Weihenstephan strain, L13 Global, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 C, and one at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 C, and people couldn't tell them apart. You would expect, I don't care what anybody says, you would expect those beers to be so drastically different given the talk about how important fermentation temperature is with lagers, that everybody would be able to tell them apart. And yet that has not been the case for the most part. It's just interesting to me that we adhere so strongly to this idea, despite the evidence kind of backing it up.
Yeah, and that one's also a fun one to me too, because I sort of think about why, this yeast was, found or discovered or just sort of came to be because we're fermenting in these cold caves at 40 degrees temperature. Why aren't we still fermenting beer in caves?
There you go.
Right? I mean, I'm like, maybe that's the best way to make beer is to ferment them in caves. But no, that's sort of, I kind of say that tongue in cheek, clearly because I don't have a cave anywhere near me, so I'm not going to go ferment in it. Maybe I'll dig one in my backyard, but I don't think the landlord would appreciate that. No, I mean, I think that's really interesting. You've got this, it was only recently, I think, was it, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago that they started even talking about Eubianus as like the relative that paired with, that created a hybrid with Saccharomyces cerevisiae to make lager yeast.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's 10 or 15 years. Lagers were made hundreds of years ago. So there's no way people knew about those specific things, or, it's just the way that they did it. It's the way that they did it, and it was successful for them. And like you said, I think there is some tendency to justify the way you do things, right? And that's certainly nice whenever you're able to do something or where you're able to perform an experiment that justifies a way that you've been brewing. It provides validation, right, to what you've been doing, and makes it a claim that you can continue to support. And so I think that's the interesting part, though, right? It's that validation is okay, but again, it's not about, you can change your brewing practices based on it, or you can keep your brewing practices on it, but it's just evidence, right? It doesn't mean that you're right or wrong because of what your current understanding is.
Yeah. Well, and so, I have had plenty of absolutely delicious, home brewed and commercially brewed lager beers that are brewed using very traditional methods. There is certainly no intention on my part to say that that's not a good way to make lager beers. I've also had very, very good, very delicious beers that are brewed not using those traditional methods. One of probably the last real big thing when it comes to lager beer brewing is the actual lagering process. It's where they got their name. There is a strong belief that in order for a lager to taste like a good lager, it has to sit for upwards of 6 to 8 weeks, and in a cool environment. And that I've heard people make the claim that the yeast are continuing to do certain chemical things and yada yada yada. I mean, maybe it is. I have not read hard evidence on that. What we know for a fact is happening is that beer is aging. Whatever happens during the aging process, whether that's reacting with oxygen in some way, whether who knows. And I personally tend to prefer the fresh flavors that I get in beer. And so my mindset, I don't care what anybody else does or thinks, but my mindset is if I can figure out a way to produce this beer that has all of those particulates that I want out of the way, gets them out of there so the beer is crystal clear, carbonated, and ready to go. If I can figure out a way to do that in less time that doesn't sacrifice quality, I'm down, because I really love lagers. I don't want to wait 2 months for every one I make. And I feel like that gets under some people's skin. Oh, I'm going to use gelatin instead of time, or I'm going to use manual filtration, like a lot of breweries do, instead of time. People look at that and they're saying, well, not only are you, offending the people who developed these methods, which is not my intention at all. And I don't think they'd feel offended if they were still alive personally, but you are literally not doing the thing that makes this beer this beer.
I guess that makes sense too. We talked a little bit about that too, in that episode that we did about lagering methods and tradition and lagering. And how I originally did let my beers sit for 4+ weeks, 6 weeks,
so did I,
sometimes 2 months, 3 months, and I thought that they made a difference, and they may have, right? I mean, I don't know, but I just found that if I'm able to shorten that time and drink the beers faster, that's certainly something that benefits me, and that's something that I'm going to continue, that I'm going to want to do, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to use findings so that I can consume the beer a week or two after it's been packaged. I just don't have an interest in waiting that time. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing that you benefit. I'm sure, and I've never actually looked, but I'm sure there are science articles out there that have been published by professors in universities that have indicated the benefits of lagering, and I'm sure that exists. And so it's not to say that it doesn't. It's just not something that I'm going to use in my brewing practices, and maybe not something that a lot of commercial brewers are even going to be interested in doing anymore either.
Yeah. Well, they got to turn beer around. I mean, that's the key. You look at, I would love to talk to Will Kemper from Chuckanut, because they truly do. Them and Freem and Wayfinder. We've had Kevin Davey on the Patreon livecast before, in fact, from Wayfinder. They're making some of the best lager beers, that I've had. I mean, they're absolutely fantastic. And I know all three of those breweries do adhere to some pretty traditional approaches, but they're turning those beers around. They're not, their taps aren't empty. So they're doing something to push those out. I'd really be interested to know more about what aspects of the traditional lager beer brewing process maybe they've given up, and which ones they specifically adhere to because it contributes positively to their beer. But those are the two, in my opinion, kind of the two, I call them brewing enclaves, because I feel like that's how they kind of come across to me. But the two areas, sour beer brewing and lager beer brewing, that do seem to have this more traditional bent, at least among some of the folks who are doing that. Now, obviously, here at Brewlosophy, we've tested a ton of non-traditional methods, many of which our results have called into question, not disproven by any means. But for some, this is just simply interesting content, which really is what we intend for what we're doing. However, others seem to take it as a threat to something they hold very dear. I'm going to be honest. I don't know how to get through to people that it's not our intent to hurt your feelings or even convince people to change the way that they brew. Actually, over the years, I've learned the opposite usually seems to be true, that those who most adamantly oppose what it is we do and think we're trying to influence change in others are really the ones who strongly desire that everyone else do things exactly the way they do things. And it made me think, we call this projection. And what that means is basically that a person is attributing to others that which they're denying in themselves, right? This thing that they know on some deeper subconscious level, they don't want to be a part of them. So they put it on somebody else and it allows them in some way to deal with it, okay? And the reality is that it's there. And if you take a look long enough in the mirror, sometimes you'll notice it. And that can be a very humbling experience, right? To recognize, why do I act like I care so much about how other people brew, of all things, No judgment, I promise you. I just think it's really curious.
Yeah, I think that concept of projection is really interesting too. And I said that above about like that comment about Shellhammer's research, that people were sort of projecting on him that he was trying to stop a, dry hopping trend.
Yeah.
Right.
God.
It was never something that he said or that I said or that anybody at Brewlosophy ever said. So I think that's sort of really interesting. And like you, I take every opportunity that I can to just tell people too, our results are just, it's the variable in isolation in that beer according to that specific tasting panel on that specific day, right? And if that's not as specific or if that's not specific enough for you or not limiting enough for you, then I don't know how I can help you.
Yeah, honestly.
The other thing I always say too is one of the cool things about professors and universities that they do is they're able to look at, gas chromatography and liquid chromatography and run these different tests to actually characterize the results, right?
Yeah.
We're looking at, can you tell a difference between the two beers? And that's beneficial, right? If you're just looking at, does this process or does this variable make an impact? Whether you can tell a difference or not is important. But the other thing that brewing scientists are doing is characterizing results. And that's not something that you and I are ever doing. We might share our opinions about why we think something is happening. But I do love, I love Brewlosophy's contribution to this, right? And that we're experimenting with these things, taking traditional brewing practices and asking the question, can you tell a difference with the beer? And again, we're not making prescriptives. We're not telling people how they should brew. We're just presenting them with evidence. And to me, that's one of the great things. That's why I love brewing science, is finding out, new information and then processing, assimilating that information and, continuing to brew.
Yeah. Well, I think that about covers our thoughts on adhering to brewing tradition. Just to be very clear, whether you're a romantic who prefers doing things the way they were done hundreds of years ago, perhaps because you think it leads to better results or just want to pay respect to those who came before us, or you cut as many corners as possible in your brewing, what matters is that you're getting something meaningful out of this. Here at Brewlosophy, we appreciate both of those perspectives and everything in between. This is supposed to be fun. Do what makes it exactly that for you. Please don't hesitate to let us know your thoughts on what we discussed today by sending us an email to feedback@brewlosophy.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our newest show, The Brew Lab, where Cade goes into the lab with brewing scientists to discuss research they've performed on our favorite beverage. And make sure to keep up with all of our beer and brewing antics over at brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.